Greetings to the fourth episode of World-Proven Conspiracies in History. In order to grasp the scope of the 415 BCE conspiracy, one must first grasp the feelings in Athens in the spring of that fateful day. The city was not just getting prepared, but it was throbbing with a kind of manic, imperial ambition. The Peace of Nisches had lasted a few years, yet the younger generation, unfamiliar with the horrors of the plague and the early Spartan raids, was bloodlustlessly rising upwards. They wanted glory, they wanted empire, and they did. They sought Sicily in particular. The assembly had voted to deploy the largest armada ever made by a Greek city to defeat Syracuse and the West. The harbor of Piraeus was a sea of ships. The triremes were newly painted, the hulls greased with tallow, the hoplites sharpened their spears. The fiercest of these hot dreams revolved around Alcibiades, the finest and most beautiful and deadly man in Athens. He directed the expedition, learned under Socrates, and was idolized by the youth. In his opposition was the wary and superstitious rich General Nisches, who had opposed the war, but who now, tragically, he was forced to lead with his rival. The city stood at a knife's edge of infinity and damnation. It was in such a hyper-charged atmosphere that the Athenians one morning woke up to the sight of their city spiritually gutted. That date, as we know it, is not written in a calendar, but it was just days before the Grand Fleet was going to sail. Upon leaving their homes, walking to the agora, or approaching the temples, the citizens were confronted with a sight that halted the veins of blood. The Hermai had been mutilated. A Herm is an odd object in the modern mind. It was an unadorned, plain, rectangular stone column, with the bearded head of the god Hermes as a crown on an obsequious and well-curving part, with an erect phallus around half the height of the shaft. These were statues, and not just memorial monuments to their subjects. They were the spiritual lightning rods of the town. Hermes was the god of borders, of journeyers, of good fortune, and of the transversal. A Herm would stand at each intersection, at the door of private homes, and in the hallowed sanctuaries, yet they were the oldest and most ubiquitous defenders of Athenian democracy. Almost every Herm in the city, and there were hundreds of them, had been vandalized in a single night. Their faces were shattered, and their phalluses dismembered. I am Zar, teaching the common man about the most well-known conspiracies of our history. Kindly like, subscribe, and comment if you like my content. This was not random graffiti. This was unified, city-wide action. It took dozens, maybe hundreds of men, silent, traveling through the dark, chiseling in hammers, and hitting simultaneously in diverse districts. That logistical coordination had terrified the Athenians more than the sacrilege. So, if a gang of men could plan this efficiently to bring down the gods, they could synchronize just as easily to make do with the throats of democrats while they slept. The victims were the stone gods, but the real victim was Athenian thought, who planned this. This chaotic storm of paranoia was the initial investigation. The city appointed a board of inquisitors called Zetit and offered massive rewards for information. Anyone, citizen, metic, foreigner, or slave, who could give a name was pledged immunity. The initial days of silence were devastating. No one knew who funded it, and no huge amounts were needed, only organization and malice. From the jump, the theories started swirling. The first and most comforting theory was that it was a drunken prank by youthful aristocrats, known as the Golden Youth, who would spend their nights drinking unmixed wine and teasing their father's traditions, but the size was just too big for a prank. Geopolitical sabotage was the second theory. The Corinthians, who were allies of Syracuse and enemies of Athens, were the blame party. Maybe, the people whispered, Corinthian agents had infiltrated the city to terrify the Athenians into suspending the invasion of Sicily. How could the fleet sail safely if Hermes, god of travelers, was mutilated? It was a psychological hit, and one aimed only at the morale of the sailors. However, a more sinister and political motive began to develop, consuming the city eventually. To a secret society of oligarchs, the mutilation was a pledge, a pistis. In ancient political conspiracies, men would often commit a terrible crime together, a ritual crime or a murder, to help tie themselves to one another. In sharing the guilt of a capital offense, they consigned no person to betray the group without punishing themselves. The Hermai were mutilated to be the opening shot of a coup d'etat. The oligarchic clubs, the Heterii, had descended upon the democracy in revolt, hated the rule of the mob, despised Alcibiades, despite his noble bloodlines, a protector of the people. The investigation quickly took a turn that would turn history. No one, then, could name the mutilators of the Hermai at first, but the plea for help led to people being let see other accounts. Slaves and servants began to talk softly about the hidden mock mysteries. They assert that Alcibiades and his wine-drinking friends were conducting the Eleusinian mysteries as parodies in the home. The mysteries were the most sacred and secretive rites in the Greek world, and promised an afterlife to initiates. Mock them, and it will lead to death. The enemies of Alcibiades, politicians like Androcles, the priestly families he despised, saw a chance. They mixed the two crimes together. They countered that the mutilation of the Hermai and profanation of the mysteries were members of the same big conspiracy to overthrow democracy and establish tyranny. They named Alcibiades' ways, his excesses of the ego, his not Athenian excesses, and inquired again, is this not the behavior of a tyrant? Realizing the danger, Alcibiades asked for instant justice. Before the fleet sailed, he wanted to clear his name, as he knew all army was loyal to him, but his enemies were cunning. They maintained that the expedition could not afford to wait. They told him to sail now and stand trial upon his return. High glory! It was a trap. They wanted him out of the city to poison the minds of the jury without his charm to defend himself. The fleet sailed with pomp and power, and the shadow of the headless Herm. I moved with them. Back in Athens, the reign of terror started. The assembly was in a state of panic. People who pointed fingers were believed. Respected citizens were rounded up and thrown in jail at the discretion of questionable informers. The most famous witness to emerge appeared to be a man named Dioclades. He appeared on the council with what appeared to be an open case. He said on the night of the mutilation he had arisen early to walk to the mines at Laurion. There he saw around the theatre of Dionysus a group of roughly 300 men standing in a circle. He holed up behind a pillar. He observed them. He proclaimed he recognized them by the light of the full moon, listed 40, 2 names as such, 2 council members, and numerous prominent citizens. The city went wild. The men named by Dioclades were arrested. Without trial, the council was ready to execute them immediately. The citizens slept at the edge, guarding the marketplace with their weapons, ready for Spartan invasion or oligarchic revolt, anticipating even a single moment of the day. It was the greatest panic. But there was a problem with Dioclades' story, a physical fact that enables us to deny his testimony entirely. The night the Hermai were mutilated was the new moon. There was no moonlight. The night would have been pitch black. Dioclades was lying. Once this discrepancy was revealed, his story fell apart. He eventually confessed to having been bribed by enemies of the accused men and was executed for perjury, but not before destroying innocent lives. With the investigation stalling and the prisons overflowing, the attention turned to a young aristocrat named Alcibiades, who turned out to be a suspect imprisoned on the basis of Dioclades' fraudulent list. Alcibiades was an aristocrat, a member of the Heterii. Facing death, his cellmates begged him to speak. He had to save them if he knew anything. Alcibiades managed to cut a deal. He would name the actual conspirators in return for immunity. Alcibiades confessed. He claimed that his drinking club, the Heterii of Ephialtes, indeed plotted the mutilation. He described a scene of drunken aristocratic nihilism. Euphaltus had proposed the plan as a way to bind members together and strike a blow against superstitious democracy. Andocides said he had opposed the plan and had apparently been incapacitated, possibly by a riding accident during the crime. So the Herm outside his own house was left untouched, a fact that made him a prime suspect from the very beginning. He gave a new list of names. The men he named were either already in exile or rapidly traced and executed, and the panic in the city finally subsided. The Athenians, in reality, thought they had cleaned up the pollution, but the damage was already done. The result of this conspiracy was the suicide of Athens. As the city was ripping itself apart in the search for the mutilators, the foes of Alcibiades had managed to recall him. The Salaminia, the state trireme, then arrived in Sicily to arrest the commanding general and bring him back for execution. Fearing he would not get a fair trial, Alcibiades requested that the Salaminia accompany him in his own ship. He gave his captors the slip at the port of Thurii, Italy. He did the unthinkable. Alcibiades defected to Sparta. The man who'd been responsible for planning the Sicilian Expedition now was sitting in the war council of Athens' biggest enemy. He said exactly what the Spartans should do to destroy his homeland. He insisted they dispatch one Spartan general, Gylippus, to plan for the defense of Syracuse. He instructed them to fortify Decilia in Attica, blocking its silver mines and agriculture, Athens' mines. In the absence of Alcibiades, the whole of the Sicilian expedition was under Nicias' command. Nicias was brave, but he was ill with kidney disease and afraid of the omens. When it came time to withdraw from Syracuse, there was a moon eclipse that frightened him. The soothsayers instructed him to wait thrice 9 days. He waited. The harbor was blocked by the Syracusans. The great fleet was trapped. The vast Athenian armada and the flower of their youth, the entire unit behind it, was decimated. Nicias was executed. The survivors were dumped into the stone quarries of Syracuse to die of exposure and starvation. This was the geopolitical shift that broke the Athenian Empire. The Hermai's mutilation opened the door to a domino effect that stripped Athens of its most effective commander, leaving its army empty, handed in an alien land. Had the Hermai not been smashed, Alcibiades likely would have remained in charge. He might have taken Syracuse, or at least prevented the total annihilation of the force, with his diplomatic brilliance and tactical genius. Instead, Athens lost its fleet, its wealth, and its prestige. The Persian Empire recognized the weakness and re-entered the war, funding Sparta's navy. The golden age of Greece was all but killed that night by the hammers of the conspirators. The actual physical artifacts that we have are the stones themselves. Archaeologists at the Agora and at the Kerameikos have discovered the bases of these Hermai. We can see the breakage points. We can spot the frantic repairs made later in subsequent years. You cannot deny the story, because the wreckage was inscribed into the geology of the city. We also have Andocides speaking on the mysteries, his speeches from years later, when he was attempting to rehabilitate his good name again. A first-hand account of the fear within the prison, of his family wailing about the fear, and ultimately the ruthless political calculus of his confession. The Hermai conspiracy also demonstrates that in a democracy a most dangerous weapon is not a sword, but rather paranoia. The mutilators did not have to wipe out the fleet, only destroy the trust between the citizens and their leaders. They smashed the faces of the stone gods, and in the reflection of those broken stones, the Athenians saw monsters in their neighbors. They ate their own, and when the ships sunk in the great harbor of Syracuse, they were sunk not just by Spartan rams, but by hammer blows that rang out in the dark streets of Athens months before. Hope you found my content enjoyable as we navigate these world's weirdest hidden conspiracies. I love your love for liking, sharing, and subscribing, and your comments are always welcome. More on these trends in conspiracies tomorrow. Thanks for watching.